You will never see your mother again. You will never run through fields or laugh without permission. You will never taste honey cakes or feel the warmth of a hearth surrounded by family. Instead, you will spend the next decade learning that survival requires perfect obedience, that hunger is holiness, and that silence is your only friend. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Dawn arrives with the first bell at 4 in the morning. No sunrise here brings warmth or hope, only obligation. Children as young as 5 stumble from their straw pallets, their bodies stiff from sleeping on floors that never warm, in rooms where breath freezes and rats scurry between the stones. At Shaftesbury Abbey in Dorset, founded in 88 AD, the dormitory housed girls from noble families who had been deposited there like unwanted furniture. Lady Godiva of Mercia sent her youngest daughter Edith to this place in 1043 AD, when the girl was barely 4 years old. Political alliance required sacrifice, and children, particularly daughters, were expendable currency in the game of medieval power. Edith's story survives in fragments within the Abbey's chronicles, written by Abbess Elfgifu in careful Latin script. Parvula Edith, she wrote, weeps without cease for 3 days and nights. Her tears freeze upon her cheeks in the morning cold. She calls for her mother in the Saxon tongue, but we speak only Latin here. She must learn that her mother is dead to her now, and God is her only father. Picture these children stumbling through their first weeks, their hair, once carefully braided by loving servants, now roughly shorn to prevent vanity. Their soft silk gowns replaced by scratchy woolen habits that chafe against skin unused to such coarseness. Their delicate hands, once protected by fine gloves, now cracked and bleeding from cold and constant work. Lady Matilda Fitzwalter, sent to Godstow Abbey near Oxford in 1185 AD at age 6, wrote years later in a letter smuggled to her sister, "I remember the taste of marchpane and the feel of ermine against my cheek. Now I know only the taste of barley gruel and the feel of rough hemp against my skin. Sometimes I wonder if those early memories are dreams, for this stone world feels too real to have been preceded by any other life." Silence wasn't golden in these places. It was survival. From the moment of morning prayers until the final bell at night, speaking was forbidden unless specifically required for lessons or confession. Girls learned to communicate through glances, through the subtle positioning of hands during prayer, through the careful placement of their bodies in the refectory. A tilted head might mean hunger. A certain way of holding the prayer book could signal illness. A particular posture during Mass might indicate that someone was struggling with despair. At Barking Abbey in Essex, renowned for its harsh discipline, the silence was broken only by the sound of leather striking flesh. The discipline chamber was a small stone room where girls were taken for infractions as minor as smiling during prayers or moving too slowly during processions. Sister Ermengarde, who served as disciplinarian from 1203 to 1219 AD, kept meticulous records of punishments in her Liber Correctionum. Her entries read like a catalogue of cruelty. Alicia, age 7, struck 5 times with the rod for laughing during none. Marguerite, age 9, 15 strokes for speaking during the reading of scripture. Beatrice, age 5, held by the arms while struck 10 times for wetting her bedding. These weren't occasional punishments. They were daily occurrences. Children lived in constant fear of making mistakes they didn't understand were mistakes. Eleanor of Aquitaine's youngest daughter, Joanna, was placed in Fontevraud Abbey in France in 1176 AD at age 11. Her letters to her mother, discovered in the Abbey's archives in the 19th century, reveal a child slowly breaking under the weight of constant surveillance and punishment. "Dearest mother," she wrote, "I have learnt to move like a shadow and breathe like a whisper. Yesterday I was beaten for allowing my thoughts to wander during matins. How do they know what I think? I fear they can see inside my mind. I fear they can see my dreams of home." Food was not nourishment. It was both punishment and control. Children ate once a day, sometimes twice if they were fortunate. The fare was gruel, black bread and water. Meat was forbidden except on the highest feast days, and even then it was given sparingly. At Wilton Abbey in Wiltshire, breakfast consisted of a small piece of bread and a cup of water. Dinner was barley porridge with perhaps a few vegetables grown in the Abbey garden. Children who arrived plump from their noble homes quickly became gaunt, their cheeks hollow, their eyes too large for their faces. But hunger was intentional. It was considered a spiritual discipline, a way to bring the body into submission to God's will. What the abbesses didn't acknowledge was that hungry children cannot concentrate on prayers. They cannot learn effectively. They become obsessed with food, hoarding crusts of bread in their clothing, dreaming of feasts instead of salvation. Agnes of Bohemia, daughter of King Ottokar I, was sent to the Poor Clares Convent in Prague in 1234 AD, at age 8. Her confessor, Brother Francis, wrote to her father, "Your daughter speaks of nothing but food. She counts the hours between meals. She weeps not for your absence, but for the memory of roasted fowl and honeyed wine. This is not devotion, your majesty. This is desperation." Winter in these stone fortresses was particularly brutal. Heating was minimal, limited to small fires in the chapter house and perhaps the scriptorium. Dormitories remained unheated, even when snow piled against the windows and ice formed on the water basins. Children slept in shared beds, huddled together for warmth, often 3 or 4 to a narrow straw mattress. At Nunnminster Abbey in Winchester, built in 1902 AD, the dormitory was a long, narrow hall with no windows and only one small fireplace at the far end. Girls slept fully clothed, wearing every piece of clothing they owned, and still woke with frostbite on their fingers and toes. Lady Isabel de Clare, sent to Amesbury Abbey in Wiltshire in 1248 AD at age 6, wrote in her adult memoir, "I remember the sound of teeth chattering in the darkness, like castanets played by invisible hands. I remember the girl next to me, Marie, who was barely 5 and came from Normandy. She spoke no English and wept every night for her nurse. One morning in February she would not wake. Her lips were blue as violets. They carried her away while we recited morning prayers, and we never spoke of her again. It was as if she had never existed." Death was common and unremarkable. Children died from cold, from illness, from malnutrition, from despair. Abbey records show infant mortality rates of nearly 30% for girls under 10. These deaths were recorded matter-of-factly, without emotion or investigation. At Shaftesbury Abbey, the death roll for the year 1209 AD lists: Johanna, age 5, died of fever on the feast of St. Michael. Marguerite, age 7, died of wasting sickness on the feast of St. Luke. Beatrice, age 6, died of consumption on the feast of St. Martin. No surnames, no family notifications, no elaborate burials. They were buried in unmarked graves in the convent cemetery, their lives reduced to brief entries in account books. Education, when it existed, was limited to basic literacy in Latin and the memorization of prayers. Most children learnt to read only enough to follow along in their prayer books. Writing was taught to a select few, and usually only to those destined for administrative positions within the convent. Mathematics was virtually non-existent. History was limited to biblical stories and the lives of saints. Science was considered dangerous, as it might lead to questioning God's mysteries. At Luckock Abbey in Wiltshire, founded in 1229 AD, the curriculum consisted of memorizing the Psalms, learning to embroider ecclesiastical vestments, and studying the lives of female saints. Lady Ella of Salisbury, who founded the abbey, wrote in her charter, "Let the young maids learn submission through scripture, patience through needlework, and humility through the study of those holy women who suffered for Christ." There was no mention of arithmetic, no study of medicine or healing, no exploration of literature beyond religious texts. These children were being trained not to think, but to obey. Physical punishment was not only accepted, but considered necessary for spiritual development. The rod, the strap, and the discipline of fasting were tools of salvation. Children who showed signs of independence or creativity were beaten until they conformed. At Dartford Priory in Kent, founded in 1355 AD, the rule stated, "Spare not the rod, for it is through suffering that the young soul learns to love God above all earthly things." The abbess, Dame Joan Vaux, was known throughout England for her harsh methods. She kept a collection of willow switches in her chamber, each marked with the names of the girls in her care. Parents who visited their daughters noted the welts on their arms and backs, but said nothing. To question the abbess was to question God himself. Sister Marguerite of Hainaut, who served as novice mistress at Poissy Abbey in France from 1298 to 1315 AD, wrote in her private journal, "Today I struck young Blanche 20 times for questioning why God allows suffering. She is 8 years old and asked why her baby brother died if God loves children. Such questions are dangerous. They lead to doubt, and doubt is the enemy of faith. Better she learn through pain than through reason, for reason leads to perdition." Sleep was interrupted regularly for night prayers. Children were awakened at midnight for matins, again at 3 for lauds, and again at dawn for prime. Their developing bodies, already weakened by poor nutrition and cold, were further stressed by chronic sleep deprivation. At Godstow Abbey, where Rosamond Clifford, mistress of Henry II, was buried in 1176 AD, the night bells rang so frequently that the children developed a strange walking sleep. They would rise and recite prayers while barely conscious, their eyes open but unseeing, their voices joining in unison chants they had memorized through repetition rather than understanding. Lady Alice Fitzhugh, who spent 12 years at Godstow beginning in 1289 AD, wrote to her niece, "I learned to pray in my sleep, to genuflect while dreaming, to sing psalms while my mind wandered through memories of sunlight and laughter. We were like clockwork dolls, wound up each morning and set in motion by the bells. I feared that if the bells ever stopped, I would collapse entirely, for I had forgotten how to move without their command." Emotional bonds were actively discouraged. Children were taught that love for family was idolatry, that affection between friends was sinful, that any attachment to earthly things was an obstacle to salvation. At Elstow Abbey in Bedfordshire, where John Bunyan would later find inspiration for Pilgrim's Progress, girls were forbidden from forming particular friendships. They were moved regularly between dormitories to prevent emotional attachments. Letters from home were read aloud to the entire community to prevent private comfort. Gifts from families were confiscated and distributed equally among all the children, removing any sense of individual care or special love. Dame Clemence of Barking, who ruled Barking Abbey from 1173 to 1186 AD, instituted a policy of spiritual detachment that forbade girls from speaking of their families or their lives before entering the convent. "The past is death," she proclaimed. "Only the present service to God matters. Those who dwell on earthly affections will find no peace in prayer." Children who mentioned their parents or siblings were punished with solitary confinement in stone cells where they were fed only bread and water until they agreed to release their worldly attachments. Young Lady Maud de Brosse, sent to Achonbury Priory in Herefordshire in 1235 AD at age 7, wrote in her secret diary, "I try to remember my mother's face, but it grows dimmer each day. Sister Agatha says this is good, that I am learning to love God more than earthly things, but I do not feel love for God. I feel only emptiness, as if something precious has been carved out of my chest with a dull knife. I pretend to be holy, but inside I am becoming hollow." Physical abuse extended beyond formal punishment. Children were regularly struck for minor infractions, pinched for inattentiveness, and slapped for showing emotion. At Romsey Abbey in Hampshire, where the future St. Christina of Markyate sought refuge in 1114 AD, the daily routine included what was euphemistically called correction. This involved the systematic use of physical intimidation to enforce compliance. Children learned to flinch at sudden movements, to keep their eyes downcast, to speak only when spoken to. The scriptorium at Shaftesbury Abbey contains a manuscript illuminated by a young girl named Adelheid in 1267 AD. In the margins, barely visible, she drew tiny figures of children with tears streaming down their faces. These marginalia were discovered only in 1923, when the manuscript was being restored. Art historians believe these were secret messages, ways of expressing pain and fear that could not be spoken aloud. The figures are crude but emotionally powerful. Stick children with enormous eyes, hands pressed to their mouths, bodies bent as if in perpetual fear. Sexual abuse, while not officially acknowledged, was documented in confession records and private letters. At Warewell Abbey in Hampshire, founded in 986 AD, Father Edmund the Confessor wrote to his bishop in 1278 AD, "I am troubled by what I hear in the confessional. Young girls speak of inappropriate touching by elder nuns, of being made to lie with sisters for warmth in ways that disturb their innocence. I know not how to counsel them, for they fear punishment if they resist, yet their souls are surely being damaged by these practices." Dame Agnes of Huntingdon, who served as abbess at Elstow Abbey from 1257 to 1281 AD, was investigated by church authorities following accusations from several noble families. Letters between Bishop Hugh of Lincoln and the Archbishop of Canterbury describe unseemly conduct with the younger maids and practices that corrupt the innocent. The investigation was quietly dropped when Dame Agnes provided substantial financial gifts to the church, and the accusers were threatened with excommunication if they continued their complaints. Lady Isabel de Fortibus, daughter of the Earl of Devon, was removed from Canonsley Abbey in Devon in 1284 AD after she sent a coded message to her father describing evil touches in the darkness. Her father, William de Fortibus, wrote to King Edward I, "My daughter speaks of things that cannot be named, of sisters who come to her bed in the night and do unholy things. When I demanded answers from the abbess, she claimed my daughter was mad with religious fervor, but I have seen the marks on her body, the fear in her eyes. I will not leave her in that place of corruption." Medical care was primitive and often dangerous. Children who fell ill were treated with bloodletting, purging, and prayer. At Wilton Abbey, the infirmary was a small stone room with no windows and minimal heating. Sick children were isolated from the community and left to recover or die with minimal intervention. The Abbey chronicler Sister Mathilde wrote in 1245 AD, "Little Constance suffers from a fever that burns her flesh and makes her speak in strange tongues. We have bled her thrice and given her bitter herbs, but she grows weaker. The abbess says it is God's will, that perhaps her suffering will purchase grace for us all." Herbal medicine was practiced by some of the elder nuns, but it was often mixed with superstition and religious ritual. At Amesbury Abbey, Sister Beatrice the herbalist kept detailed records of treatments. For fever in children, mix wormwood with holy water and blessed salt. If the child continues to burn, apply leeches to the temples while reciting 50 Ave Marias. Should the fever break, give thanks to Saint Dymphna. Should the child die, give thanks to God for calling another innocent soul to heaven. The psychological impact of this isolation and abuse was profound. Children who survived to adulthood often displayed what we would now recognize as trauma responses. They had difficulty forming relationships, experienced nightmares and anxiety, and struggled with depression. Lady Margaret Beaufort, who spent 3 years at Maxstoke Priory in Warwickshire from 1439 to 1442 AD, wrote in her private devotional book, "I am 30 years old, and still I wake in terror when church bells ring. I still count the hours between meals. I still find myself moving silently through my own home, as if noise might bring punishment. The child I was in that place is dead, but her ghost haunts every moment of my life." Some children attempted escape, though few succeeded. At Godstow Abbey, a girl named Mabel of Gloucester attempted to flee in 1278 AD by hiding in a cart carrying supplies to Oxford. She was caught and brought back, where she was imprisoned in the Abbey's underground punishment cell for 3 months. The cell was barely large enough for a child to lie down, with no light and minimal food. When she was finally released, other children reported that she had lost the ability to speak coherently and would rock back and forth while humming tunelessly. Dame Alice of Normandy, who served as abbess at Malling Abbey in Kent from 1289 to 1305 AD, kept a detailed record of escape attempts. Her journal records, young Marie attempted to scale the walls during matins. She fell and broke her arm, which I take as God's punishment for her defiance. Catherine tried to hide in the hay wagons bound for Canterbury. She was discovered and brought back for proper correction. Isabel feigned illness to avoid morning prayers, hoping to be taken to the infirmary and thence to escape. All these attempts reveal the same evil, the unwillingness to submit to God's plan for their lives. The most heartbreaking aspect of these records is how systematically these children were broken. They arrived as individuals with personalities, preferences, and dreams. They were transformed into hollow vessels for religious devotion, their spirits crushed under the weight of absolute obedience. At Barking Abbey, the chronicler Sister Euphemia wrote with what seems like satisfaction, "Young Lady Philippa arrived last spring full of worldly pride and stubborn will. She spoke often of her silk gowns and her pet falcon. Today she knelt before me and begged forgiveness for her former vanity. She has requested that her beautiful hair be cut even shorter, that her meals be reduced further, that she be given additional penances. God has conquered her rebellious heart." This was not education. This was systematic destruction of personality and individuality. Children learned that their thoughts were dangerous, their emotions were sinful, their bodies were shameful. They were taught to fear their own minds, to distrust their own feelings, to submit completely to authority without question. At Romsey Abbey, the novice mistress Dame Scholastica wrote instructions for training young girls. The child must be taught that her will is corrupt, that her desires are evil, that her only hope lies in complete surrender to God's representatives on earth. She must learn to hate what she once loved, to fear what once brought her joy, to find peace only in absolute submission. The irony is that many of these children were from wealthy, powerful families who could have provided them with excellent educations, comfortable lives, and meaningful futures. Instead, they were sacrificed to political expediency, religious fanaticism, and the belief that suffering was somehow purifying. Lady Eleanor de Montfort, daughter of Simon de Montfort, was sent to Amesbury Abbey in 1265 AD at age 8, following her father's death in battle. She wrote to her mother, "I had everything a child could want: books, music, fine clothes, loving servants. Now I have nothing but cold stones and endless prayers. They tell me I am blessed, that I am closer to God than those who live in the world. But I feel farther from heaven than ever, for how can a God of love create such misery for his smallest children?" Some children found ways to preserve their sanity through small acts of rebellion. At Shaftesbury Abbey, archaeological excavations in the 1960s uncovered a cache of small objects hidden in the wall of the dormitory: a wooden doll, a piece of colored glass, a pressed flower, a letter written in a childish hand. These were treasures hidden by children who refused to let their humanity be completely extinguished. The letter, written in Norman French, reads, "My name is Eleanor. I am 7 years old. I have been here for 2 years. I remember my mother's voice when she sang to me. I remember my father's beard against my cheek. I remember my dog Rousseau, who would sleep at the foot of my bed. I write this so that someone will know I was here, that I was real, that I was loved." The long-term effects on these children were devastating. Many died young from illness, malnutrition, or despair. Those who survived to adulthood often struggled with mental illness, inability to form relationships, and a deep-seated fear of authority. Some became abbesses themselves, perpetuating the cycle of abuse they had experienced. Others, when they finally escaped or were released, found themselves unable to function in the normal world. Lady Matilda of Gloucester, who spent 8 years at Wilton Abbey beginning in 1245 AD, was finally retrieved by her family when she was 16. Her brother Earl Gilbert wrote to his mother, "Matilda is so changed I barely recognize her. She speaks only in whispers, starts at sudden sounds, and will not eat unless given explicit permission. When I embraced her, she flinched as if I meant to strike her. Whatever they did to her in that place, they have killed the girl I once knew and replaced her with a frightened ghost." The economic aspect of these arrangements cannot be ignored. Wealthy families paid substantial dowries to place their daughters in convents, often more than they would have paid for marriage arrangements. The convents became wealthy institutions, accumulating land, gold, and political influence through these transactions. At Shaftesbury Abbey, the account books show that in 1267 AD, the abbey collected over 2,000 marks in dowries for accepting noble daughters. This was an enormous sum, equivalent to millions of dollars today. Dame Juliana of Norwich, who served as abbess at Carrow Abbey from 1342 to 1359 AD, wrote frankly about the economic incentives. "The noble families pay handsomely to be rid of their surplus daughters. We provide them with a holy justification for what is essentially abandonment. The children suffer, but the coffers are full, and the church grows stronger." I sometimes wonder if God approves of this exchange of innocence for gold. The most tragic aspect of these arrangements was how completely the children were forgotten by their families. Once a child was placed in a convent, she essentially ceased to exist for her relatives. Inheritance laws were written as if she had died. Marriage alliances were made without considering her existence. Family histories often omitted mention of daughters who had been given to the church. Lady Agnes de Vesky, who was sent to Arden Priory in Yorkshire in 1308 AD at age 5, wrote 20 years later, "I have received no word from my family since the day I entered this place. I do not know if my parents live or have died. I do not know if my brothers have married or had children. I am a ghost to them, and they are ghosts to me. Sometimes I wonder if my family was real, or if I dreamed them in another life." The psychological techniques used to break these children were sophisticated and systematic. They were isolated from everything familiar, subjected to constant surveillance, punished for expressing emotion, and rewarded only for complete submission. At Nunmonkton Priory in Yorkshire, the rule stated, "The young maid must be watched always, for in solitude she may remember her former life and grow sorrowful. When she weeps, she must be corrected. When she smiles, she must be questioned. When she speaks of home, she must be punished. Only when she shows neither joy nor sorrow, but perfect indifference to all earthly things, has she achieved the proper state of grace." Modern psychologists would recognize these techniques as systematic psychological abuse, designed to create learned helplessness and complete dependency. The children were taught that they were powerless, that resistance was futile, that their only hope lay in absolute obedience to their captors. At Barking Abbey, the novice mistress Dame Euphemia wrote, "A properly trained child should move like a shadow, speak like an echo, and think like a prayer book. She should have no desires of her own, no opinions of her own, no dreams of her own. She should be an empty vessel, ready to be filled with God's will as interpreted by her superiors." The rare accounts of children who maintain their spirit despite years of abuse are particularly poignant. Lady Marguerite de Clare, who spent 6 years at Amesbury Abbey beginning in 1282 AD, secretly kept a journal written in a coded script she developed. Her entries reveal a child determined to preserve her identity despite overwhelming pressure to conform. "They have taken my name and call me Sister Scholastica. They have taken my hair and covered my head with rough cloth. They have taken my voice and demand silence. But they cannot take my thoughts, though they try. In my mind I am still Marguerite. I still love the feel of silk and the taste of honey. I still remember my mother's laughter and my father's stories. They may own my body, but my soul remains my own. The complicity of families in these arrangements is perhaps the most difficult aspect to comprehend. Parents who claim to love their children willingly sent them to places where they knew they would suffer. The letters between parents and abbesses reveal a shocking callousness toward children's welfare. Lord Hugh de Mortimer wrote to the abbess of Ackenbury Priory in 1278 AD, "I send my daughter Isabel to your care. She is willful and prone to laughter, faults which I trust you will correct with appropriate discipline. Do not spare the rod, for I would rather have a godly daughter than a happy one." Lady Joan de Geneville wrote to her daughter at Amesbury Abbey in 1290 AD, "I am pleased to hear that you have learned submission and no longer weep for your former life. Your suffering now will purchase ease in the world to come. Remember that earthly happiness is fleeting, but heavenly reward is eternal. Bear your trials with patience, and know that I am proud of your sacrifice." These letters reveal parents who had convinced themselves that they were acting in their children's best interests, that suffering was somehow beneficial, that breaking a child's spirit was a form of love. The psychological mechanisms they used to justify their actions are eerily similar to those used by abusers throughout history. The claim that pain is necessary, that it builds character, that it serves a higher purpose. The medical consequences of the harsh conditions were severe and well documented. At Wilton Abbey, the death records show that nearly half of all children admitted died before reaching adulthood. The causes were varied but predictable: malnutrition, disease, exposure, and what the chroniclers euphemistically called failure to thrive. Modern physicians would recognize these deaths as resulting from systematic neglect and abuse. Sister Marguerite the Infirmarian at Shaftesbury Abbey wrote in 1289 AD, "Young Beatrice grows thinner each day despite our efforts to feed her. She cannot retain food and speaks constantly of her mother. I fear her body fails because her spirit is broken." The abbess says this is God's will, but I have seen many children sicken and die in this same manner. Their bodies seem to give up when their hearts are destroyed. The psychological concept of failure to thrive was unknown in medieval times, but the symptoms were clearly observed. Children who could not adapt to the harsh conditions would gradually waste away, losing weight, becoming listless, and eventually dying without any obvious physical cause. Modern understanding of trauma would recognize these deaths as the result of severe psychological stress manifesting in physical symptoms. Educational opportunities for these children were minimal and focused entirely on religious instruction. At Larcock Abbey, the curriculum consisted of memorizing Latin prayers, learning to read basic religious texts, and acquiring rudimentary skills in embroidery and manuscript copying. There was no instruction in mathematics, science, history, or literature beyond religious works. The goal was not to educate, but to indoctrinate. Dame Ella of Salisbury, foundress of Lacock Abbey, wrote in 1232 AD, "Let the young maids learn only what is necessary for the service of God. Too much learning breeds pride, and pride is the root of all sin. Better they remain ignorant of worldly knowledge and pure in their devotion, than clever in their speech and corrupt in their hearts." This deliberate limitation of education served multiple purposes. It kept the children dependent on their religious instructors, prevented them from developing critical thinking skills that might lead to questioning authority, and ensured that they would be unable to function independently in the outside world. Children who had been raised in convents from early childhood often found themselves completely unprepared for secular life if they were ever released. The physical conditions in these institutions were often deliberately harsh. Cold stone floors, unheated dormitories, and minimal furnishings were considered character building. At Godstow Abbey, the dormitory was described by a visiting bishop in 1278 AD as colder than a tomb and darker than a dungeon. The beds were straw pallets placed directly on the floor, with thin woolen blankets that provided little warmth. Windows were few and small, creating a perpetual twilight that contributed to the atmosphere of gloom and depression. Water for washing was limited and often frozen in winter. Children were expected to maintain cleanliness with minimal resources, and failure to do so resulted in punishment. At Romsey Abbey, the rule stated, "Cleanliness is next to godliness, but comfort is the enemy of devotion. The young maids shall wash in cold water and find joy in their discomfort, for it reminds them of their mortal nature and their need for divine grace." The psychological impact of constant discomfort cannot be overstated. Children who are cold, hungry, and uncomfortable cannot focus on learning or spiritual development. They become obsessed with their physical needs, creating a cycle of suffering that undermines the very goals the institutions claim to pursue. At Barking Abbey, a visiting physician noted in 1285 AD, The children here are so preoccupied with their bodily discomfort that they cannot attend to their prayers. They shiver through Mass, fidget during lessons, and dream of warmth instead of salvation. Social isolation was another tool of control. Children were forbidden from forming friendships, discouraged from showing affection, and punished for displaying loyalty to anyone other than their religious superiors. At Elstow Abbey, the rule stated, "Particular friendships are the devil's snare. The young maids shall love all equally and none specially. They shall not exchange gifts, share secrets, or show preference for any companion. Their hearts must be reserved for God alone." This isolation created profound loneliness and despair. Children who had been torn from loving families found themselves surrounded by peers but unable to form meaningful connections. The natural human need for companionship and affection was treated as sinful, creating additional guilt and shame. Lady Alice de Lacy, who spent 5 years at Nunmonkton Priory beginning in 1301 AD, wrote, "I am surrounded by other children, but I am more alone than if I were the only person on earth. We are forbidden to comfort each other, to share our sorrows, to offer friendship. We are like islands in a sea of silence, each drowning in our own despair." The long-term psychological consequences of this systematic abuse were severe. Children who survived to adulthood often displayed symptoms that modern psychologists would recognize as complex post-traumatic stress disorder. They had difficulty trusting others, forming relationships, and functioning independently. Many became perpetrators of abuse themselves, unable to conceive of child-rearing without harsh discipline and emotional deprivation. Dame Margaret of Anjou, who became Abbess of Amesbury Abbey in 1315 AD, after spending her childhood there, wrote to a fellow abbess, "I know no other way to train children than as I was trained. The rod and the harsh word were my teachers, and they shall be teachers to the children in my care. I sometimes wonder if there might be gentler methods, but I fear that kindness breeds weakness, and weakness breeds sin." The cyclical nature of abuse was particularly evident in the religious orders. Women who had been brutalized as children often became the brutalizers of the next generation, perpetuating systems of cruelty that continued for centuries. At Shaftesbury Abbey, the same methods of discipline and control were used from the 12th century through the dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th century, passed down from one generation of abbesses to the next like a deadly inheritance. The economic exploitation of these children was also significant. Their labor was valuable to the convents, and they were expected to work long hours in addition to their religious duties. At Wilton Abbey, girls as young as 6 were assigned to the scriptorium, where they spent hours copying manuscripts in cramped conditions that damaged their eyesight and stunted their physical development. The Abbey's account books show that the sale of manuscripts copied by child labor generated substantial income for the institution. Lady Constance of Brittany, who spent 7 years at Wilton Abbey beginning in 1287 AD, wrote, "My hands are permanently stained with ink from countless hours of copying. My back is bent from hunching over manuscripts. My eyes strain to see in dim light. We are not students here. We are laborers disguised as novices." The children who worked in the kitchens fared no better. At Barking Abbey, girls as young as 5 were assigned to help prepare meals, working with sharp knives and boiling water under minimal supervision. Burns and cuts were common, treated with little sympathy. The Abbey chronicler noted, "Young Matilda burned her arm severely while stirring the porridge. She bore the pain without crying, which shows proper spiritual development. Pain teaches patience, and patience teaches devotion." Perhaps most tragic were the children who never fully broke, who maintained some spark of their original selves despite years of systematic abuse. These children often suffered the most, as their resistance was seen as evidence of spiritual corruption, requiring ever more severe correction. At Godstow Abbey, a girl named Johanna of Winchester spent 3 years in various forms of punishment for her refusal to stop asking about her family. She was eventually confined to a cell so small she could not stand upright, fed only bread and water, and forbidden all human contact except for daily interrogations about her willingness to submit. The records of her questioning, preserved in the Abbey's disciplinary files, reveal a child of extraordinary courage slowly being destroyed by institutional cruelty. "I asked again if God truly wants children to suffer," she told her interrogators. "I asked why prayer feels like poison in my mouth. I asked why I dream of my mother's face if I am supposed to forget her. These questions come from my heart, not from the devil. Why is my heart so evil?" After 6 months of solitary confinement, Johanna's questions stopped. She emerged from her cell silent and obedient, her eyes empty of the fire that had once burned there. The Abbey chronicler wrote with satisfaction, "Johanna has finally achieved the proper state of submission. She no longer asks troubling questions or speaks of her former life. God has conquered her rebellious spirit. But conquest was not salvation, it was destruction. These children were not being prepared for heaven, they were being prepared for hell on earth, trained to accept suffering as normal, abuse as love, and silence as virtue. The very qualities that made them human, curiosity, affection, hope, were systematically crushed in the name of holiness. The dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII in the 1530s finally freed many of these children, but freedom came too late for most. Women who had spent their entire lives in convents found themselves unable to function in the outside world. They had no practical skills, no understanding of secular life, no ability to form normal relationships. Many became beggars, others retreated into hermitages, and some went mad from the shock of sudden liberty. Lady Margaret Pole, who had been imprisoned at Sion Abbey as a child, wrote after the dissolution, "They have opened the cage, but the bird has forgotten how to fly. I stand in sunlight and feel only fear. I hear laughter and do not understand its meaning. I am free, but I am not alive. They killed the child I was so thoroughly that no woman could grow from her remains." The stories of these children remind us that institutional abuse is not a modern invention. The systematic destruction of childhood in the name of higher purpose has ancient roots, and the justifications used by medieval abbesses echo through the centuries in the words of every authority figure who has ever claimed that cruelty serves a noble end. Tonight, as you lie in your warm bed, remember the children who slept on cold stone floors, who wept silent tears into straw pillows, who dreamed of mothers' faces they were forbidden to remember. Remember that these were not distant figures from a barbaric past. They were children like any children, with the same needs for love, comfort, and kindness that children have always had. Their voices were silenced, their names forgotten, their suffering dismissed as holy sacrifice. But in the margins of manuscripts, in the cracks between stones, in the whispered confessions of dying nuns, their stories survive. They remind us that the price of unquestioned authority is always paid by the most vulnerable, and that no cause, however sacred, justifies the destruction of a child's soul. The bells that once called them to prayer have long since fallen silent. The stone walls that imprisoned them have crumbled. The abbesses who tormented them have returned to dust. But the echo of their suffering remains, a warning from the past that childhood is sacred, that innocence deserves protection, and that any system that systematically destroys the young in the name of salvation is itself damned. You wake to the sound of bells cutting through darkness, but this time you do not wake alone in a cold dormitory surrounded by frightened children. You wake in a world where childhood is valued, where children's voices matter, where suffering is not mistaken for sanctity. The bells that ring now call not to enforced prayer but to memory of those who had no choice, no voice, no escape from the stone fortresses that promised heaven but delivered only hell. Remember them. Remember their names when you can find them. Remember their pain when records preserve it. Remember their courage when it flickered briefly before being extinguished. Remember that they were children first, victims second, and statistics never. In remembering, we honor not just their suffering, but their humanity. And in honoring their humanity, we guard against the return of systems that would sacrifice children on the altar of any cause, however noble it claims to be.